2021 will be a happier and healthier new year, and that at some point in the new year, we'll all be able to actually reach out and see each other and touch each other and be together. Um, Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you about some of our upcoming programs, which in fact are still on Zoom. The next one will be in February, on February 16th, and we'll focus on WIL's program in Cambodia, the Community for Premier Villages, highlighting the health literacy advisors and featuring Dr. Gail Brenner, who will share her personal volunteer experience in the Cambodian villages, working to improve the health and well-being of the families living in remote Cambodian areas. And then we are very excited. We have just finalized our other program for the spring on Thursday, April 15th, with Louise Lindenmeyer, who is the sister of one of our WIL members. And she is a nurse practitioner and executive director of Hispaniola Health Partners, which was also a WIL recipient. And she's going to talk about the history of an equitable and sustainable women's healthcare system that she helped to create in rural Haiti. So we're all over the globe this spring, and it should be a really very provocative and thought-provoking programming. So welcome everybody, and I will now turn it over to Anna Maria, our president, who will kick off the program.
Thanks, Debbie. And welcome everyone. Welcome members to our first program of 2021 at the end of this historic day. We are so excited this evening to welcome our presenters from MIT's Abdul Arif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, whose mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. What a perfect day for us to be focusing on scientific evidence. They do this through research all over the globe, policy outreach, and training. A few days ago, I sent a brief 15-minute TED Talk to your email, which is a great introduction to the types of complex questions that the Poverty Action Lab seeks to address. And we're going to hear more about those issues this evening. I saw this TED Talk years ago, and I realized that it would be a great organization and of interest to WIL members. Our grants and micro teams perform the due diligence necessary to award funds. Today, we'll learn about how to be even more effective and maybe even better informed as we seek to eradicate poverty together. This program is being recorded, available on our website. So tell those who are not able to attend tonight that they're available for viewing. I would ask everyone, please go on mute, submit your questions via chat so that we can all read them and our presenters will answer them at the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Priyanka Varma is a senior policy associate at the Poverty Action Lab, where she supports the education sector and manages post-primary education initiatives. Taking lessons from across education research, sharing these lessons with policymakers, practitioners, and donors to help them integrate evidence into their programs and policies. Prior to joining the Action Lab in 2019, Priyanka worked at the Brookings Institution Center for Universal Education, where she studied the scaling up process of effective education interventions in low and middle income countries. Priyanka holds a Master of Philosophy in Education, Globalization, and International Development from the University of Cambridge and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations and Policy Science from the University of Pennsylvania. Yay. Mackie Pfeffer is a policy associate at the Poverty Action Lab Global, where she works on environmental energy and climate change, producing publications and conducting policy research for evidence dissemination. She graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Computational Statistics and Political Science from Minerva Schools at KGI in 2020. Prior to joining the lab, Mackie was a research and teaching assistant at the College of Social Sciences at Minerva Schools and interned at the lab's policy and research teams. Eki is a native German speaker and proficient in French and Italian. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, and Priyanka, you're advancing the slide so you can share your screen and do so.
Yeah, I think Micah actually might share her screen if that works.
Okay.
Yes, okay, I think I need permission to
Okay,
share the
let's see.
screen.
All right, I just made you co-host, so I'm hoping that.
Yeah, that works. Let's see.
Great.
Can everyone see?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our presentation today on translating global evidence into action, a conversation with JPAL and Women International Leaders of Greater Philadelphia. And a huge thanks to Anna Maria for inviting us to join today. My colleague Micah and I are really excited to speak with you all and kind of share more about JPAL's work with you all, specifically how we're looking at the gender sector and its cross-cutting themes in education, health, and various other sectors. And we're also looking forward to a conversation at the end of this to kind of talk through how this all fits together with the WIL's work. So thank you all again for joining. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a packed agenda today. And so Micah and I will aim to cover a lot of content fairly quickly. We'll save questions at the end just to kind of keep on time and avoid holding you guys up too long. But for today's agenda, we will kick things off with an introduction to JPAL. So who we are, what we do, and kind of a bit more detail on how we think about evidence to policy and translating one from the other. We'll then dive into the evidence within the global gender space. So we'll focus specifically on health and sexuality, education, finance, and political economy and governance. And then we'll leave space for questions as mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. I can just do a very quick introduction to the two of us. So again, I'm Priyanka Varma. I'm a senior policy associate at JPAL's global office based out of MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I did do my undergrad in Philly, so I definitely have a soft spot for the city of Philadelphia and really excited to speak with you all today. And within JPAL, I work largely on the global education sector. I'm joined by Micah, who's a policy associate on JPAL's environment, energy, and climate change sector. Micah also works with the global office, but she's currently based out of Germany. So huge thanks to Micah for staying up late for this presentation and giving us your time this evening. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and kick things off in terms of who we are and what we do. I think an overarching question many of you might have is, how do we look at this idea of poverty alleviation and what does that exactly mean? Next slide. So as we all know, poverty is a complex problem. At JPAL specifically, we conduct rigorous impact evaluations to kind of shed light on this complexity. And we see our work as just one part of the solution. But by testing, innovating, and finding answers to critical questions, we help governments, donors, and NGOs be more effective. And the global community has really been tackling widespread poverty for many decades. As we see here on the screen, billions of people still struggle to make ends meet and millions remain in extreme poverty. Next slide. So to help respond to this pressing issue, governments and NGOs have been trying to tackle poverty for centuries, as we know, and many programs and policies aren't always effective, or sometimes they have unintended impacts that aren't always measured. Next slide. So in the field of impact evaluation, the most rigorous type of evaluation is a randomized evaluation, and this is kind of the type of research that we focus on at JPAL. Because of the way they're conducted, randomized evaluations can tell us not only whether a specific policy or program had an impact, but can also measure the scale of that impact. So how large was that actual impact? And if the study is well designed, it can tell us why we see the results that we do. And so this idea of innovation and learning is kind of at the heart of our work. And if we're not learning, we're not innovating, and policies and programs will continue to potentially sometimes kind of fail to meet the needs that they're hoping to achieve. So on the slide, we start to introduce randomized evaluations. So kind of as I was alluding to, JPAL focuses on randomized evaluations to really understand what is working and what isn't working when it comes to social programs and policies. And based on this evidence that we develop, that's kind of how we pull out some key lessons, and in today's case, in the gender sector. So I imagine many of you are already familiar with the randomized evaluation methodology, but in case any of you are looking for a quick refresher, I can kind of walk through this very quickly, since it's such a fundamental part of our work. So in terms of a quick hypothetical situation, let's say we have a tutoring program and it's intended to improve students' test scores. Of course, there's going to be some variation in students' baseline characteristics. You know, some students will be stronger, some will be weaker. If we look here on the graph, we're indicating stronger students in like the darkest color orange and weaker students in the lightest color orange. And our goal is essentially to understand whether the tutoring program had an impact and what that impact actually is. But we also want to know whether there's other factors at play. So for example, the socioeconomic status of the students, students' motivation going into schools, other factors that we might not be able to easily observe. And those sometimes are driving the effects that we end up observing. And so in an ideal world, we'd give a program to a group of students, we'd see how their test scores changed, and then we'd go back in time and kind of measure what the impact of the test scores would have been if they didn't actually have the program. Obviously, that's not possible. And so we kind of aim to achieve a similar goal by randomly assigning individuals to either receive the program, so that's the intervention group at the top, or they don't get the program at all and they continue with business as usual. And that's a group at the bottom, the comparison group. And so because the individuals are randomly assigned, we can be confident, fairly confident at least, that they don't differ systematically at the beginning of the study. So before the program starts, the group that receives the tutoring program is not systematically better or worse at test taking than the group that doesn't get the program. And because the groups are randomly assigned, you know, of course, there will be some differences here and there. But if the sample size is large enough and we're looking at enough students in this case, those differences will be fairly small. And so after this initial randomization, we can actually roll out the program. Next slide. So here we can see, you know, because the only systematic difference between the two groups is the presence of the program, we can confidently say that the difference in outcomes between the two groups is because of the intervention. And so I guess like another way to put this is randomization allows a causal interpretation of the difference between the intervention and the comparison groups. And in this case, we can see that the tutoring program did have a positive effect on test scores for students in the intervention group. And so that's kind of a very, very quick and rough introduction to the randomized evaluation methodology used by JPAL. Next slide, please. Okay, so over the years, JPAL has developed this network of more than 220 affiliated professors from around the world who are united in their use of randomized evaluations to answer important questions related to poverty and social policy. Next slide. And our goal at JPAL is essentially to take those randomized evaluations, take that evidence, learn from it, synthesize those lessons, and actually translate it into action. Next slide. And you can hit next a few times. So yeah, it's perfect. So what does that mean? I know it all sounds very vague. So maybe I can break it down into our three basic groups of how we connect the dots from research to action. So first, JPAL funds cutting edge research on priority questions when it comes to poverty alleviation. And we help our affiliated professors carry out their research projects by providing research support on the ground. We have about 10 different sectors that we work in, which I'll walk through in just a second. And we have policy experts that we work with to kind of understand how can we adapt research findings and distill them into advice and guidance for governments, NGOs, foundations, and just others who are trying to make their programs more effective and cost effective. On the right-hand side, we see our capacity building work, and this kind of draws from our research expertise. So we teach the principles of randomized evaluations to researchers and research staff on one hand, and then our partner organizations on the other hand. And we see these three different branches of our work to be kind of interconnected. So innovative research generates important policy insights, and then the trainings are designed to help lead into more policy relevant research. Next slide. We benefit at JPAL from having this global knowledge, but also a local grounding. So I'll touch on global knowledge first, and then I'll go into more of the local grounding piece. So we have a network of about over 200 academic researchers worldwide who work in about 88 countries from around the world. And to date, they've carried out more than 1,000 randomized evaluations across several different sectors. So we can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we look at agriculture, environment and energy, finance, kind of the full gamut of different sectors. And so even though for today's presentation, we're looking at education specifically, and then within that, how it fits into education, health, political economy, and governance and finance, JPAL has similar bodies of evidence in different sectors. And so if there's any interest amongst this group to learn more about a specific sector, Micah and I are really happy to make those connections and introductions. Next slide, please. So in terms of the local grounding piece, this is what I feel is really critical for the success of our work. So we have 7 regional offices and then several satellite offices around the world. And our teams in these offices, basically their role is really to understand what are the local issues. They understand the local context and they understand the local languages. And they kind of form very close relationships with partners such as government organizations, advocacy groups, NGOs, to help map this global evidence that we've been developing to the priorities of that partner agency to really build this culture of evidence-informed policymaking in these places around the world. And so that's kind of where JPAL's mission fits and how all of our different pieces kind of fit together. Next slide. So evidence from these randomized evaluations is kind of changing the way that we understand and address problems related to poverty. And policymakers, practitioners, and funders worldwide are increasingly applying this learning to their social programs and policies. I think something that's really exciting about our work is that to date, over 400 million people have been reached by programs that were scaled up after being evaluated by JPAL-affiliated researchers. And many more, of course, have benefited from just some of the broader ways that evidence can inform policy. Next slide. Okay, so what does this actually look like? We can go to the next slide. Here's where we kind of get into the evidence side of things. So when we look across the global evidence in gender, we can divide it into 4 areas that we'll hone in on for today's presentation. So we have health and sexuality, education, markets, and institutions. I'm just flashing kind of the key lessons across those different subsectors here on the screen for you all. No need to memorize this by any means. We'll actually go, Mike and I will split up going into some of the key lessons within each of these sectors to walk through what this means and how it ties into the global evidence. I will talk through the first 2 subsectors and then Micah will take on the last 2. Next slide, please. Okay, so now diving into the actual evidence. So question might be, what does the global evidence say in terms of health and sexuality? And by this, we're thinking about women's agency over the timing of marriage and childbearing. And we're also thinking about issues like freedom from violence. Next slide. So to lay the foundation a bit, every year, about 16 million girls between the ages of 15 to 19 give birth in low and middle income countries around the world. And we often find that pregnancies are more frequent among marginalized communities, with a significant share of pregnancies in countries with a high adolescent birth rate being unplanned. Some consequences of adolescent pregnancy, which many of us know, include health complications, school dropout, limited job prospects, and then just more generally, greater vulnerability to poverty. Next slide. Next slide again. Yep, perfect, thanks. So when looking across the global evidence, we find that there are 3 types of interventions that can reduce adolescent pregnancy. And we divide these into financial incentives as the first category, information interventions as the second category, and subsidies and scholarships as the third category. And we'll kind of go into each of these categories in the next few slides. Next slide. So financial incentives. Financial incentives can offset the motivation for girls to engage in behaviors that can lead to pregnancy. So what do we mean by this? Financial incentives can enable girls to stay in school longer and alleviate families' economic pressures to marry girls early. They can also delay relationships that lead to childbearing by reducing income-related motivations for women to enter into transactional relationships. So maybe just to share one quick example, in the case of Bangladesh, researchers found that providing households with an in-kind incentive of cooking oil conditional on girls and young women remaining unmarried, delayed marriage and childbearing for girls, so girls who are in school and also out of school. And so this is a really nice example of a financial incentive, even though it's not direct cash. Cooking oil is very valuable for families, and how it was able to kind of offset girls from getting married at a young age by encouraging them to stay unmarried and focus on other priorities, economic contributions, education, whatever it might be in this case. Next slide. Next, yeah. You can just click through. So adolescent sexual behavior can be responsive to information about sexual and reproductive health. Information that kind of addresses the trade-offs related to decisions about sexual activity can be more effective in changing behaviors than simply urging girls to remain abstinent. And so we see this in different scenarios. More generally, information programs which enhance life aspirations can often lead girls and young women to delay childbearing. And so the idea here is that adolescents who hold optimistic beliefs about their future opportunities might be more likely to avoid risky sexual behaviors and more likely to engage in more productive economic activities. Next slide. So subsidies and scholarships is kind of the third area. So subsidies and scholarships can support girls to continue their education and can encourage delays in pregnancy. And this can happen in one of three ways. So first, it can change adolescent girls' time use patterns. So more time that a girl spends in school is like the less time that she'll spend with her partner. Second, an increase in girls' investment in education might cause girls to want to avoid pregnancy in order to earn higher future wages. And third, the third way is helping adolescent girls better process decisions around childbirth and thereby shape fertility preferences and sexual behaviors. And so let's take a look at what this kind of looks like in practice. So we can click through this slide. So there's two examples here that I'd like to highlight. One is in Ghana, one is in Kenya, which focuses on this idea of subsidies and scholarships. In Ghana, researchers randomly awarded scholarships using a lottery system to students who were accepted into secondary school. They found that 8 years after, so kind of thinking longer term, once the girls reached around age 25, women who were offered the scholarships were about 18% less likely to have an unwanted pregnancy. And then similarly in Kenya, researchers found that providing upper primary school girls with free school uniforms reduced the rate of adolescent pregnancy by about 17%. And more generally, it kind of helped girls avoid dropping out of school and settling into relationships. And so the takeaway on that previous slide is that subsidies and scholarships can be effective at reducing adolescent pregnancy. Okay, so switching gears, I know I'm like speeding through this, apologies. So now kind of moving on to gender-based violence. We have a few statistics on the screen here that are kind of unsettling, but I want to bring to light a few of them that really stand out to me without going super in depth. First, 4 in 5 women believe that violence against women is justified in certain circumstances. And 1 in 3 women face intimate partner violence. And so beliefs that are prevalent in society may be reflected in women's experiences when it comes to violence. We also see here on the screen that 1/3 of all women in low and middle income countries report that they can't refuse sex with their partners, and fewer than 40% report seeking help after experiencing violence. And so a lack of agency in this space and prevalent attitudes about violence may be kind of hindering this idea of reporting violence incidences. Next slide, please. So when it comes to thinking about what are some potential solutions, how can we address issues of gender-based violence? One thing we look at are cash and food transfers. So researchers have found that cash and food transfers reduced physical and sexual forms of violence in some settings by alleviating poverty-related stress, increasing women's decision-making power, and changing women's tolerance for violence. But it's important to note that these impacts weren't sustained past the end of the intervention. So they were successful during the program and then afterwards kind of faded out. But these kinds of programs were oftentimes unconditional. And in cases where there were conditions on the transfer, so if you receive this money, you have to do X, Y, Z to kind of ensure your economic livelihood. Those kinds of cases where the transfers were conditioned were proven to be a little bit more effective in ensuring sustained effects on intimate partner violence, even beyond the end of the intervention. And we see this in different settings in Bangladesh, from Bangladesh to South Africa, so different kind of geographic regions. And all that being said, we should also keep in mind that these are all very early stage results, and there's a very limited number of evidence within this space. So when we look at cash and food transfers, I think there's only about 5 studies that we're looking at. So I wanted to caveat by saying that, you know, this specific part of the evidence, we don't have as much knowledge as we'd like to. And so it's definitely an area where we're encouraging more research, especially because, you know, women, of course, are not all the same. There's different subsets of women, and they might kind of have different experiences with some of these types of programs. Next slide. So while we kind of see mixed results when it comes to cash and food transfers, researchers find that anti-violence programs and campaigns can actually protect women from violence, and many do so by changing attitudes. So just to elaborate on this, we find that there's strong evidence that intentional programming to counter intimate partner violence, so couples dialogues, media campaigns, gender trainings, when integrated into regular women's programs, so for example, women's self-help groups that we see in India, these have been effective in decreasing the prevalence of intimate partner violence. Next slide. So to share an example, this is a study that I find really interesting and unique and wanted to highlight with you all. So in Uganda, researchers hired screenwriters to script and film 3 short films with local Ugandan actors. The first short film described a really sympathetic, likable woman whose husband beat her severely despite her efforts to appease him. The second video, very short film again, started with a woman's hospitalization given just intimate partner violence, and ultimately ended with her funeral. And in the video, they show that her parents and her daughter were aware of issues of intimate partner violence, but weren't able to help her. And then the third short film offers a very, I guess, like a more hopeful example of what this could look like, where a woman was a victim. She disclosed to her parents what was happening at home. They informed a local women's counselor who visited the home and offered support. And so all 3 videos were played during intermissions of Hollywood movie screenings. And videos were kind of shared randomly, and afterwards attendees were surveyed to kind of get their thoughts on what the videos meant. Next slide. And so researchers ultimately found that the program didn't necessarily affect community attitudes towards violence, but it did change perceptions of social sanctions against reporting. And this change led to an increase in reporting and decrease in intimate partner violence. And so there is some certainly promising evidence when it comes to addressing issues of gender-based violence. And this idea of these media campaigns, for example, is kind of an interesting takeaway. Next slide. Okay, so we will kind of summarize the lessons on health and sexuality after we wrap up education. Now turning over to education, let's kind of focus on what the crossroads of gender and school participation look like. Next slide. So just some background. As of 2018, over 130 million girls ages 6 to 17 were out of school. As we can kind of see here on the graphs, more girls seem to be enrolled in primary and lower secondary school, but the number of girls out of upper secondary school seems to have remained high. If we can click the next slide, we can see here some of the barriers to girls' education. So they include poverty, distance to school, early marriage and pregnancy, gender-based violence, you know, perhaps it's unsafe for girls to actually physically get to school. And then also conservative gender norms are a common barrier. And this prevents girls from being able to stay in school even once enrolled. Next slide. So one important question that arises when we think about getting more girls into school is if programs aimed at increasing participation across the board for girls and boys impact girls as much as they impact boys. In other words, do these kind of generic programs that kind of focus on bridging the gender gap, are they effective or do they kind of retain the gender gap? Do they enlarge it? Like, what's the impact of that? Another question we might have is, do programs require a gender targeted approach to bridge the gender gap? So is it more effective to focus on specific barriers to girls' education? So, you know, perhaps gender separate toilets, is that more effective than a program that's kind of helping boys and girls more broadly together? So this is kind of something that researchers grapple with, and we have some interesting findings in this space. Next slide, please. What we find across, I think, about 45 or so studies is that studies that take or programs that take a general approach at increasing school participation help the most disadvantaged gender the most. So in most cases, girls are the most disadvantaged gender. They start farther behind in school participation. And by school participation, we mean enrollment and attendance. So being registered for school and actually attending school. And so we find that because girls are farther behind, they tend to gain more from the program as a result. But this doesn't mean that girls are always the ones who benefit more. In some cases, so for example, in Nicaragua and Colombia, we see that boys started farther behind than girls when it came to school participation. And so when a program was rolled out that targeted both boys and girls, the boys actually benefited more. So it doesn't mean girls didn't benefit, they just didn't benefit as much since they weren't as far behind, if that makes sense. And so basically the takeaway is that programs which support boys and girls tend to benefit the disadvantaged gender more. Next slide. Meanwhile, gender-specific barriers like menstruation, for example, might restrict girls' mobility and thereby hurt girls' educational attainment. But we find that there's little evidence on programs that focus on gender-specific barriers, so we definitely need more research in this space. Of the studies that are available, we can focus on one particular study in Nepal, which is particularly interesting. Researchers found that providing 7th and 8th grade girls with reusable menstrual cups increased girls' use of the actual cups, but it didn't actually impact their school attendance. So even though we would think, okay, menstruation is a reason why girls aren't able to attend school, we found that just providing the cups wasn't enough. It didn't do enough to get girls back into school and kind of attending regularly. And so programs that address gender-specific barriers seem to be less effective based on the evidence that we have than just general programs that look at both boys and girls. Next slide. Okay, so just a quick summary and perfect. So a quick summary here is in terms of adolescent pregnancy. So just to recap what we walked through, the timing of marriage and childbearing is responsive to certain interventions. So information programs, financial incentives, subsidies and scholarships, as mentioned earlier. In terms of gender-based violence specifically, cash and food transfers are effective in the short term, but more intentional programming to address violence against women is generally just more effective and more sustainable. In terms of school participation, addressing issues of school participation for both genders benefits the most disadvantaged gender most, again, which often is girls. And there's limited evidence on the effectiveness of programs that target gender-specific barriers to schooling. So that's like a very quick run through of the gender evidence in health, sexuality, and education. I'll turn it over to my colleague Micah to walk through the next two subsectors.
Great, thank you, Priyanka. I know we're speeding through this a little bit, but we definitely want to make sure to also leave time for questions in the end to, talk again about any of these sectors or studies that you might have any questions about. And for now, I'm going to move on with some evidence in the sector of finance and markets. So to start off, financial services are generally designed to help individuals, families, and businesses to manage daily needs, smooth consumption, and also just have greater resilience to shocks more generally. Yet at a global level, 72% of men own a bank account as compared to only 65% of women. And this gap is greater in low and middle income countries. Women face a range of these gender-specific barriers that we already touched on to accessing financial products, in this case, including, for example, having less power in the household, facing greater levels of responsibilities for household chores, limited financial literacy, in some cases also legal obstacles, depending on the context in the country, and also the product design of these financial services themselves. Many economic empowerment interventions rely on this theory that basically increasing women's access to financial resources will also increase their income relative to other family members. This could or should then translate into enhanced decision-making power and economic agency for women, along with longer-term changes related to women's economic roles in the household and society at large. Yet in this review specifically, we found little evidence to support this idea. And this is consistent with previous reviews where we found that access to microcredits, savings groups, and business grants had inconsistent and often limited impacts on women's income generation. So while access to various savings and credit interventions had small positive effects on women's income generating ability, the effects were usually modest and didn't generate sustained improvements for income generation. Likewise, we also find that financial interventions did not consistently lead to increased influence over household decisions for women. One exception to this may actually be conditional cash transfers. So those tended to increase women's decision-making power in Latin America, for example. However, the outcomes measured to assess decision-making are frequently associated with the conditionalities in these conditional cash transfers. For example, increasing women's decision-making power over, let's say, children's schooling. And as mentioned before, there is strong evidence that intra-household dynamics also play a role in explaining the limited impacts for women. Multiple studies have highlighted how gender norms could moderate the impacts of interventions on women's businesses. And there is some evidence to suggest that this could be due to selection into lower profitability businesses, such as, for example, home-based production of retail goods. And dynamics within household relationships could also play a role. For example, in Uganda, researchers evaluated the impact of a bundle of interventions to support startup businesses. And they found that women with access to the program doubled their earnings, but that's not true for women who reported that their partner didn't treat them well. And from that, researchers also concluded that the quality of women's relationships with intimate partners was an important determinant of economic success here. There are 3 field experiments in India, Ghana, and in Sri Lanka that had previously found that women's businesses in many contexts had lower returns to capital than men's business, so less return to an investment made in these businesses. So let's zoom in on India for a second. The research here was conducted in Kolkata, and 3 years after providing flexible microfinance loans, researchers surveyed every business owner to understand profitability. So again, looking at these sort of long-term sustained effects. There were roughly 3 kinds of households in this study. In about 30% of households, only the woman owned a business. In 31.5, another person in the household owned a business, which was usually a man. And in 38.5% of households, both people owned a business. And the flexible loan contract increased men's business profits, but actually had 0 effect on women's business profits on average. So researchers proposed 2 possible explanations for this. One, the choice to invest in the man's business reflects a choice to invest in the business with higher returns. Or it may just be that women's own enterprises are high return, but their capital is directed to other household businesses because they lack control over it. So ultimately, this body of evidence indicates that access to financial resources does not guarantee that women also have control over these resources. So those are still 2 potentially quite separate things. Yet smart design features of these financial services can potentially help us work around some of these constraints that women may face. And there are 3 examples outlined on the screen here that actually identify quite a clear trend. The key is, again, not access, but whether or not access translates into direct control. In the first example, commitment savings accounts, those are accounts that don't let the account owners withdraw funds until they reached a certain goal. And they increased women's household decision-making power in the Philippines, potentially by enabling women to protect funds against other household pressures. In India, in the second example, opening bank accounts in women's names and then depositing payments into this account and providing women with information sessions on the accounts led to greater engagement in making purchases and also women's labor force participation. And then lastly, this third example here in Niger, researchers compared mobile payments through cash transfers to digital payments and found that the digital payments increased women's mobility, potentially through enabling them to keep the timing and the size of the payment hidden from other family members. So there's kind of an element of privacy here that we're talking about. Taken together, providing more direct channels to the woman that potentially offer this privacy is one potential way to enhance women's control over financial resources. So overall, we found that livelihoods and financial groups are an effective platform for providing access to financial services and resources to women. So in this context of groups and social networks. In turn, access to financial services and resources through groups can lead to further economic impacts in some cases also. And we found that microcredit groups can lead to positive, but not necessarily transformative impacts on women's entrepreneurship, business creation, and also the expansion of existing businesses. And we further explored the nature of the mixed findings on women's decision-making power here, but failed to identify an underlying explanation for why some programs were effective and others weren't. So we couldn't attribute differential impacts to program design or to regional differences or initial level of decision-making power, for example. And I also want to emphasize again that measurement challenges that may have contributed to a lack of clear takeaway here when it comes to decision-making power are quite common, and researchers who specialize in women's economic empowerment frequently cite these measurement challenges related to intra-household decision-making. So that's where a lot more research is needed on this front also. Okay, with that, and I know it was quite a quick run through, but yeah, so I'm going to move on for now to our last sort of sector of evidence that we're going to cover today, which is the evidence from the political economy and governance sector. And maybe a quick explanation in that case, this means looking at female representation in institution and politics. And I'm going to be sharing a bit more about a very commonly discussed issue, which is gender quotas. So I'm going to get to that in a second. So as of 2019, less than 25% of national parliaments or parliamentarians around the world were women. So underrepresentation of women in politics continues to be an issue. And on the slide here, we can see the top 5 countries with highest percentage of women in office. And number 1 here is Rwanda, 61%, then Cuba, Bolivia, Mexico, and Sweden. And those numbers are of 2019 for now. So let's look a little bit more into how the preferences of people actually translate into policies. Along the screen here, you can see kind of a progression of how preferences are turned into policy in these 4 stages. And there are several open questions at each stage, how gender it would exactly impact this process. So to tease that out a little more, we are sort of connecting a question about gender impacts to each of these stages here to make clear when these are happening. So first is the question, do preferences actually differ by gender? And then next in participation, there's the questions what barriers there are to participation for women. And this could include mobility for women, whether their voices are being heard, and gender norms that place domestic or child-rearing responsibilities onto women, which also constrains their time and resources to engage in politics if they wanted to. Also, there are barriers of getting women into elected office, and exploring those is another sort of open question. And this could include gender discrimination against female candidates or a lack of mentorship, resources, or education. And then lastly, sort of on the policy end of this chart, once elected, do women really enact the policies that align with what women care about to really take that last step to actualizing preferences into policies? So these are some of the barriers we identified, and through rigorous evaluations, as Priyanka had explained earlier, JPAL researchers can see the impact of policies designed to promote gender equality. And for now, I will be focusing on representation and, as I said, specifically on gender quotas as a way to increase women's political participation. So this study here is conducted in India. The unique design of reservation systems, which I'm going to explain in a second, in village councils, allowed researchers to estimate the impact of gender quotas in the Indian state, West Bengal and Rajasthan. The village councils are responsible for infrastructure. So this includes public buildings, water infrastructure, or roads, for example, and targeting beneficiaries of government benefits. And these village council positions are elected by direct vote every 5 years. For this study specifically, villages were randomly selected to have 1/3 of village council seats and the council leadership position reserved for women in a certain election cycle. One general result that we see from this study is an increase in participation. So female villagers are significantly more likely to speak at meetings when the village council leader is a woman. For example, women do not speak at all at half the meetings in unreserved villages, so where there aren't any reservation for female politicians, and where the council leader is usually a man. But attendance at meetings for either gender is unaffected by this reservation system. The likelihood that a woman speaks increases by roughly 12% when the council leader position is reserved for a woman. So we can see that this has an impact in how women are participating in these political happenings here. Another result pertains to drinking water and roads as political issues covered by these councils. And preferences differ by gender here. In West Bengal, women complained more often than men about drinking water and about roads. And village councils reserved for women, on average, invested in 9 more drinking water facilities and improved road conditions by 18%. But preferences also can differ by context, which is important to note. So unlike in West Bengal, compared to men, women in Rajasthan complained less frequently about roads, and most complaints still centered around drinking water, but in this case also around welfare programs. And here, women invested in 2.62 more drinking water facilities, and on average made fewer improvements in road conditions. Other impacts included increasing police responsiveness to crimes, increasing women's entrepreneurship, and improvements in children's health and nutrition. And researchers were, in the same study setting, also interested in seeing how exposure to female leadership may decrease gender bias. So over the duration of the study, villages could be reserved for female leadership never, or in 1 election cycle, or twice, so in 2 election cycles. And at first, evaluation by members of female-led village councils reserved for the first time were significantly worse than those of predominantly male village councils in never reserved villages. So just to put it more simply, basically the village council that had a female leader for the first time in an election cycle rated the female leader worse than they rated their male leaders. However, this actually changed and improved over time, and in village councils that were reserved for women more or were reserved for women twice. So basically they've gone through the gender quotas for 2 election cycles now. Evaluations of female leaders were indistinguishable from those of male leaders in other villages. So this gap had disappeared after having the position reserved for a woman over 2 election cycles. And this goes to show that there are ways to change perceptions to show men that women can be effective leaders. And this effect persists even after the woman has left office. So there's quite a sustained impact here, which is very interesting to see. And here we really see a norms change, and a sustained one, around women's potential for leadership and chances of election. So in an election without a quota, women in villages that have never seen the gender quota before, or in villages that, as compared to villages that saw the gender quota over 2 election cycles, those villages were 17% more likely to elect a woman as, were 7% more likely to elect a woman compared to 10% in villages with no history of a quota. And quotas also change girls' and parents' aspirations. So parents were 15% less likely to believe that a daughter, but not a son's occupation, should be determined by her in-laws. And girls also were more likely to not want to be a housewife or have their occupation determined by their in-laws, to not want to marry after 18, to want to marry after 18 and to want a job that requires an education that way. And women in village councils also led to an increase in girls' education, essentially erasing the gender gap in education in the setting. Girls also spent less time in household activities, which probably gave them more time to study and improve their educational outcomes. So overall, in this study, gender quotas had an impact on gender norms, both related to the self, so in the form of aspirations, and to the family, for example, in the form of household investments. Okay, so to summarize what we've covered in these last 2 sections, microcredit has shown to not have a transformative impact on business and household outcomes, and access to financial resources doesn't necessarily equal control over these resources. And smart product design can help women gain control over these financial resources. Livelihoods and financial groups for women provide an effective platform for intervention delivery, and social networks can help encourage or even amplify these positive effects. Women face gender-specific barriers to participating in the labor market. Providing childcare, for example, might help women to enter and stay in the labor force. And as we just talked about on the topic of female representation in decision-making and institutions, gender quotas can improve women's representation in politics, increase provision of public services, and also improve perceptions of women as leaders and act as sort of an, like aspirational example for girls also. Okay, this is all from me. And to learn more, I'd encourage you to check out our website and publications also by our faculty directors, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. And if you're interested in looking more into RCT-based research, I would also encourage reading Running Randomized Evaluations by Rachel Glenister, who's our former executive director. And if you do want to learn more about program evaluation specifically, I would also recommend looking into our MicroMasters courses. They're online and anyone can register. And as you saw on the slides in the very beginning, you can follow us on social media or sign up for our monthly newsletters. Those are great ways to stay looped into latest conversations around poverty alleviation, including gender, new papers or also policy publications coming out, etc. So yeah, thank you so much for having us today. And we are happy to open it up to questions if there are any, and also very happy to follow up and send over more resources as needed, yeah, depending on sort of what you might be interested in hearing more about.